music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
I'll be swinging through New York and DC this coming September and October, so please reach out if you want to meet up. Email me at jorschneider@gmail.com or on WeChat at Jordan Schneider and ChinaEconTalk.substack.com. You've all signed up already, haven't you? So what's it like reporting outside of first-tier China? How to process interacting with mainlanders when talking about Hong Kong? What is uniquely bad about the Chinese superblock urban planning and TV dramas? And what bright lights are there in Chinese culture to focus on when things get really depressing here? To discuss this grab bag of topics, we have Lauren Teixeira, a freelance reporter based in Chengdu. Lauren, welcome to ChinaEconTalk.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Lauren, unlike 99% of the foreign journalists in China, you're living outside of the Beijing-Shanghai bubble. So how did you end up in Chengdu, and what's your pitch for living outside of Tier 1 China?
Wow, thank you so much for asking that. I first came to China, actually not to Beijing. I first landed in Nanjing, which is another second-tier city. But I did eventually make it to Beijing because I knew that's where all the journalists were. But then the problem was that's where all the journalists are. So... I think China coverage is way too Beijing oriented, but more importantly, Beijing is just fucking expensive, and it makes me really depressed. So I am a freelancer, and so there was nothing keeping me here except, of course, my lovely friends. But I do, come back often to see them, and so I just kind of picked up and I moved to Chengdu, and I've been there for almost a year.
So why Chengdu?
Because I like it. It's very cosmopolitan without having like kind of the baggage of a first tier city. And the food is great. People are cool. There's like good local culture. I had been many times on like various trips. And so it just felt right as a place to go.
Where would you recommend the younger version of yourself to go and stake out her own territory?
Chengdu.
No, I mean like a different. I'm asking like for like a different city. Like
okay, a different city.
What else is on the list?
Okay, of all the second tier cities, I mean they were all far from first, but I would say in second place places I would move to maybe Chongqing, which is kind of an inverse of Chengdu in many ways, and is just a really fascinating city because Chengdu is very flat. It's just topographically flat and very relaxed, whereas Chongqing is just all hills and not very relaxed. It's kind of intense, but in an exciting way. I don't think it's as livable as Chengdu, but it's really a fascinating place. And then also Xiamen is quite nice as second tier cities go.
And like the worst one you've been to?
The worst city I've been to in China, besides Beijing.
Hey.
Like the worst place I've ever been to in China. There's places I've been in northern Jiangsu that were pretty rough.
Okay.
It's not really, Suqian, Suzhou, those are places people don't really go out of their way to visit. I mean, one of the tragedies of China coverage is that it really only centers on a few cities, and occasionally if anybody can be asked to like get out into the countryside. But the vast majority of people don't live in first tier cities, and there should probably be more coverage of just shitty third-tier cities and Xinjiang and places like that, but just nobody wants to go there.
Let's start with some of the writing you've been doing about Chengdu and the environs. So, of course, Chengdu hip hop, home of Higher Brothers, Cafe Hu, among others.
Yeah.
How did you first get introduced into this scene?
Actually, so it was pretty by accident. My friend, I have a British friend who in fall of 2016. Because when people know that you are a China person, they sometimes will just send you anything even tangentially related to China, which is mostly annoying. But
my Latin teacher in high school,
yeah.
I feel very bad for her whenever there's like that op-ed saying like Latin is really important because she gets it 15 times.
Yeah. And so this guy, he knew I was a China person, and he just had seen their video on 88 Rising and sent it to me. And I'd never heard of them before. And I was kind of bowled over because they just seemed like really cool. Which was, not something I'd ever encountered in Chinese people my age, of just being like chill and like confident and original and not just really pressed about like buying a apartment. And so then about less than a year later, I realized no one had really done a good article on them. And so I just pitched it and I wrote an article on them. And they were, that was before they got really big. So they were still like, they were very like just excited and nice. And, yeah, it was cool to hang out with them.
So then what?
Then what? I don't know. They're still cool. I mean, I ran into Masaway the other day, actually, a few weeks ago, and he was really friendly. They're still around in Chengdu. They've kind of branched out into their various businesses. I believe Nono is he's both started a streetwear label and gotten into the car detailing business.
The car detailing
Yeah,
business.
he has
Why
a car
not?
detailing shop in the suburbs of Chengdu. But but they did. I guess what you're getting at is they took quite a turn recently in that they both Nono and Mello on Instagram they did send some fairly strident nationalist rhetoric.
Yeah, I'm still debating whether or not this is gonna end up with them getting subbed out of the of the intro music. On the one hand, it's just a flag, right? I feel like Vava, she was like shame on Hong Kong, which might have been a little too far for me, but I can sort of like go with the like 中国第一名.
But then they were like replying really aggressively to a lot of people's comments. In like being dismissive of their Hong Kong fans. So
I feel like I'm kind of like one of those like fans of Kanye who just like keeps wanting to find reasons to not cancel him because I just like I'm into it.
I'm not really into cancel culture anyway. Like I think you just kind of have to accept that sometimes people who are good artists don't have good politics, and in a way, if you keep the song as your intro, it will just continue to reflect changing youth sentiments in China. So, I don't think you have to erase it.
So when I see friends on WeChat sharing like the CIA did Hong Kong and like these Hong Kong idiots, like I feel really sad, but there's a part of me which, like cancel culture is really hard when your friends all live in a media environment where like different perspectives aren't easily accessible. So I'm curious if you have a take on like not necessarily culpability, but like how much like agency it's right to apply to young people in China for their views on these sorts of things.
It's funny. Yeah, I was just talking about this with Ian Johnson like 3 hours ago, and he was having the same revelation, and he was like, there's a ceiling for your rhetoric because at some point you can't tell someone to look it up because they can't look it up.
Yeah.
Just epistemologically, there's not, you're not on even ground. And so if you want to really like get into a real discussion with someone, you basically have to red pill them. You know what I mean? Like
I was about to say, it's actually
you really do.
It's
that
out there. The sort of Western opinions on and like the Western information you're bringing to these sorts of questions.
Yeah, because you can't just be like send someone an article. You have to be like, oh, by the way, there's an entire world of information that you don't have access to, and the reason is because your overlords don't let you because it's dangerous. Like, so it's better to just like nod your head in arguments.
Yeah.
And just be like, and so it's hard, dude. Like, and it's frustrating. Like my basically, so ever since I moved to Chengdu, my friends are all Chinese, and like they're like very like hip, like edgy Chinese people who are like speak excellent English, watch foreign shows, are generally like have VPNs even. But when I've tried to engage them on the subject of Xinjiang or Hong Kong, they are either uninterested or kind of incredulous. They just don't want to talk about it, or they don't believe it. And then it always ends with something like, oh, well, I'm not that interested in politics anyway.
Yeah.
I think it's understandable in that just there's no reason to be into politics, right? If you know nothing's ever going to change and you've never grown up in a culture of having political dissent, then why would you get into it? My Chinese friends who are into it, I mean, they're basically, there are people who have just accepted that they're always going to be on the margin of society. And this is what got me in trouble with a lot of the tankies yesterday on Twitter is I was posting about a friend of mine from my grad program who he had studied abroad. He's a Haigui, and he posted something pro Hong Kong on WeChat Moments. And one of our classmates immediately deleted him. Another asked him to blur her out of his profile picture. But he's like such an outlier in terms of all the Chinese people I know. I know there are WeChat groups for like people like him, and I know those are getting like wildly censored right now. But it's like a tiny subculture of Chinese people our age who like are just like very actively monitoring the situation and like are just clear like that the Hong Kong protesters are in the right, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I remember when I first got here, like I think my first month or two, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be like Jordan and like talk about democracy and shit. And then you realize very quickly that like that's not the game. And then I think I had like a solid 2 years of like, oh, listening is interesting. Like it's sort of fun hearing like what people think about these sorts of things. But when there's something like that Hong Kong that happens, you just like don't want to fucking hear it. And it's one of these things where you get reminded on a daily basis about the type of country you're living in. And it's it's a real bummer because like there's so much like life and vitality in young China when you listen to stuff like Higher Brothers and whatever. But on the other side of things, there's still a lot in contemporary Chinese society which is very objectionable to my liberal American eyes.
Yeah. Yep, it's a bummer to say the least. You just feel it in the air sometimes. Like my friend Brendan once said, he's just like my asshole clenches whenever I get into Chinese airspace. Like the second the plane crosses over the border, you're just like something about you just tenses up, and it's just you're in a different world, right? I mean, we've seen pretty clearly the splintering of China from the rest of the world, not just in the internet, but like lots of infrastructure, financial, something I read about recently is the splintering of the idol world. I mean, everything is just going to break off, and you're going to feel it in the air, this like very thick vapor of oppression.
So anyways, let's talk about that piece then. You wrote recently about the sort of evolution of like idol culture in China, this idea of the of idols as sort of a stand-in for the evolution of Chinese pop culture. You've written two pieces recently, one about the kind of softicization, I don't know, like the softicization as well as like the de-Koreanization of Chinese pop idoldom. So what's going on in this space?
Wow. I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's very interesting to me because I guess for the lay listener, like, I guess now BTS is becoming big in America, but it's something that I think wasn't quite clear to me how different Asian pop culture is from Western pop culture, and that Asian pop culture idols as like an industry are just huge.
Yeah.
Commercially, you see their faces blown up everywhere on endorsements. Like just celebrity endorsements are so much bigger here than they are in the States.
You think so?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And especially celebrity endorsements by young men. We don't even have something resembling an idol industry in America because, I mean, South Korea kind of pioneered this, and it's a system for creating idols who are, singers and dancers who are really good looking and cute and can be used to sell a ton of products, right?
So just to be clear, it's like Disney, what is it called? Disney, what did like Justin Timberlake and Britney Spears
Oh,
do?
what was that? The Mickey Mouse Club?
It's like So it's like the Mickey Mouse Clubs on steroids. Basically, they
on
take
a
these
lot
like
of steroids.
They take these like 9-10-year-olds.
Yeah.
They take them
it's
out
not
of
that young. It's not that young. It's like the earliest they'll be recruited is like 13 or 14.
Okay. Anyway,
yeah.
so they leave school.
No, they stay in school nominally.
They stay in school.
Yeah,
you tell me, you're the expert.
The Seoul High School of Performing Arts is where all the young idols are nominally studying.
Okay.
Because I think they legally have to stay in high school. But I think what happens in practice,
it's like the NCAA, right? You're like going to school.
Yeah. And so there's a place called in Seoul called the High School of the Performing Arts, which by the way would be an amazing article if anyone was ever to let me in there. But it's full of these trainees, idol trainees, who have been recruited and who are going to school part-time, but also like training with their idol group to like debut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like the most attractive school.
It's just the hottest school in the entire world.
So anyway, so they sign contracts very early, and their freedom is very much restricted, and their kind of lives are controlled, and they come out with these manufactured personalities, which has a part of them shining through, but it's very much like in a like sort of old Hollywood system where you're kind of controlled by the machine around you.
Yeah, traditionally that's basically how it works. There's kind of an interesting fracture going on that's been caused by BTS that belongs to a whole nother podcast, but BTS kind of was a coup for the idol industry, and that the reason they succeeded is because they were able to circumvent the institutions around it. Just by showing their true selves and by just being very direct with their fans, right? So typically idols in speeches, if they win an award, the first thing they say is, I thank the CEO of my agency.
Oh, yeah.
But BTS...
Who's like always some like creepy man.
Yeah, I mean, usually, allegedly. I'm scared. But BTS, what they did is like, it's very horizontal. Like they always first thank their fans. They're just super sincere, and they just are just generous with their personal lives. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was their coup, and I think and they came from a small agency as well.
Coming back to Korean stars in China, and how this idol system has changed, how the influence of the Korean idol system has changed.
Yeah, so if we go back to that piece I did, which was the pop idols are too soft for the party, it traces the origin of this Haoxian Rou phenomenon, the little fresh meat, and which is the term coined on the Chinese internet for basically Korean style idols in like 2012, 2013, which was a huge year because it was the year that EXO, which is probably the second biggest boy group of this of this decade, blew up. And that group had very cannily recruited Chinese idols, two of which were Chris Wu, aka Wu Yifan, and Luhan, aka Luhan. And so for a while, it was kind of the golden age of Korean wave culture coming into China because they could just go and have, just sell at stadiums in China because they were so big because they had these Chinese speaking idols and people just adored them. And then, so that imported like Korean fan culture into China. And that was a big victory for SM, which is their agency, which is kind of the biggest and most ruthless agency in the idol industry. But that didn't succeed for very long because what happened is a year and a half later, the Chinese members, with the exception of one, sued them for maltreatment and went back to China and made just an absolute killing, being huge idols in their home country. Because it does have a growing middle class and there is a population of 1.4 billion here, so they could make just a ton of money.
Sure.
And then, so that was the first blow. And then the second blow was the THAAD missile defense system, in which South Korea agreed to cooperate with the U.S. to build a missile defense system that China sees as a threat to its security. And China levied sanctions. And ever since 2016, no Korean idol group has been allowed to come into China to give a concert or just promote. I mean, Korean stars who had previously been on lots of Chinese reality shows came here all the time. Their faces would be blurred out in reruns of shows. Oh, yeah. I mean, come on. You saw season 2 of Rap of China, right? It gets real Stalinist here. If they don't like someone, they just boop, just blur out the face, mosaic the face. So that was a big change. And so then what started to happen is it's kind of like import substitution. It's half import substitution and half, I think, just a concerted effort to build your own idol industry that you can better control. I mean, because, for example, there would be all these geopolitical conflicts. Like if something happened in the South China Sea, the Chinese idols would have to go on Korean television and be like, fuck this, like China, I'm a patriot. There was once a Taiwanese idol who waved a Taiwanese flag on a Korean reality show, and she had to, absolutely bend the knee to get back into the good graces of China, which was putting pressure on her agency. And so, it's just too spontaneous, stuff like that for China. And so in the past few years,
there's also a commercial aspect to it. There was investment in this industry. People started to understand the steps that it took to create these idols. Yeah,
and it's another classic issue and they do still rely on South Korean expertise, which, by the way, is the idol industry in South Korea is way at overcapacity now, and so we'll probably keep seeing professionals from Korea coming in. And what China's going to do?
That's so funny. It's like I remember I was at the curling. The curling world championships here in Beijing and met the coaches of the Chinese team, who of course are all Canadian. So it's like you're importing the coaches from South Korea to give everyone the dance lessons. And
by the way, I mean, K-pop and various sports are exactly the same idea. Like the sport, it's kind of like communist sports culture in a way, in that at a very young age you just train like crazy. You all live together in dorms. And I am writing a story about MMA right now, and it's just insane how the crossover, or just how in how many ways it's similar, the MMA industry to K-pop.
So what's up with girl groups in China?
Typically girl groups are big, but they have never been as big as boy groups. It's actually, that's a whole nother interesting thing, because also like the dances they do are not as complicated as boy groups, and so it's also less respected.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea why? Or is it just like really obvious?
It's like why their dances are less complicated.
Yeah. Well, it's just like the look they're going for is like to be cute.
I think I'm
sure they're very competent dancers, right?
Oh, no, I'm sure they're great dancers. It's just if you ask like dance instructors, they'll be like, oh yeah, it's way easier to teach girl K-pop dance than boy K-pop dance. Huh. Yeah. But girl groups are big, but they don't, I mean, I guess for obvious reasons, because the base is still teen girls. It's not all teen girls, but the boy groups do have a stronger hold over that demographic base. But there was there have been two very popular idol production shows in the past few years, and one of them was Produce 101, I think was the girl one.
Yeah.
And that was very popular, although I don't think quite as popular as Idol Producer, which was the boy one. But Produce 101 did. I mean, you had Wang Ju, who is the woman who was like slightly curvy, although still like incredibly gorgeous. Like if you saw on the street, she'd be a beautiful woman, but everyone was like, oh, she's so unconventionally beautiful, and that's my queen. And she had quite a rise to fame, and she's now she's getting her bag as the mainland Chinese spokesperson for Fenty Beauty, which is Rihanna's beauty brand.
Oh.
Yeah. So Fenty's finally entering China, and she's going to be their spokesperson.
Shout out to whichever marketer picked her.
Oh yeah, that was the perfect choice, because Fenty's whole thing is like beauty diversity, and they'll have like women
she's
in
like she's like 2.5 shades darker.
Yeah, she's like 2.5 shades
idol.
darker, 10 pounds heavier, but it's a start. But yeah, so girls groups, you don't see them in endorsements as much. You still see them, but yeah, it's a big industry, but not as big.
So you recently wrote a piece comparing the Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and mainland Chinese versions of this one show called Meteor Garden, which must have taken hundreds and hundreds of hours of your dedicated research. I'm curious what you what you came from this deep cross-cultural pop culture analysis.
This is just my sweet spot, man, is if I get to watch a lot of romantic comedies and write a pseudo socialist article about it. That's my happy place. No, but I mean seriously, like
so what was the show, first of all?
The show is called it has several names. It's known in Taiwan as Meteor Garden, in South Korea as Boys Over Flowers, and Boys Over Flowers, so it's Hanayori Dango in Japanese, which means boys over, or that's how they translated it. But it comes from a manga that first was published in 1992, and then there was a live action Taiwanese version in 2001, and then Japan adapted it live action, Korea adapted it live action, Korean, because that overlapped with the whole Hallyu wave. So that was just absolutely huge. And then mainland China remade it last summer. Mm-hmm. And the premise is there's like this clique of just absolute tyrants who rule over this high school, and they're all the sons of large conglomerates. And they're just, they like just resort to physical violence to bully the school population. I mean, they just have their thumb on the kids at this school. And I think to me, it was a pretty obvious metaphor for the effects of like the financial crisis on East Asian economies, and it was, I mean, the creator of the manga said like this was explicitly about what happened in Japan after the crash in 1990 and how we were all just completely screwed by the really rich people who had run away with our money. And of course, the conglomerates bounced back pretty fast. Well, ordinary people, there was layoffs. And to this day, Japan is in its lost decade, right? I mean, salaries have been stagnating. They've never bounced back. And the same thing happened after 97 to some other East Asian economies. And I just thought the show was kind of a brilliant satire, in the form of a teen romance drama, because the protagonist is this girl who is working class, but her parents kind of are just plotted to get her into this school, the one ruled by this clique of horrible boys. And of course, she stands up to the leader of this clique, and they eventually fall in love, although only after, lots of turbulence. And she's working class, and her family is, they're in a really precarious situation, and their class really does actually influence their relationship. And my criticism was in the new one, their class doesn't really come into it at all, right? So this clique of boys they're no longer
in the
mainland Chinese one, yeah. So this group of boys they're no longer just dumb tyrants. They're like, because the main guy, the heartthrob, he is just dumb. He's like straight up dumb in the earlier ones, which is great because it shows the rich are not deserving. They just kind of are born into this wealth. But in the new one, he's like a finance genius who's like made all his money himself, and it's just it perpetuates the mythos of the deserving rich, and so and of course China is
So why do you think that was the rewrite, the mainland rewrite?
Well, because China wants to tamp down any narrative about social inequality and massive wealth inequality that exists in this country.
So why was the show even made in the first place?
Because they knew they could make a version that completely was declawed, right? They were like, let's just make an acute romantic comedy about a rich, deserving, perfect boy who falls in love with a nice working class girl, right? So, the new version sucked ass. In conclusion.
Let's now turn to another theme of yours, which is buildings and architecture more broadly. So what first drew you to this topic?
Okay, yeah. So I think I've always been very sensitive to the built environment. I don't know why, or what's more that I don't know why other people aren't. Like, to me, it's like obvious that you would be very affected by the buildings and infrastructure around you. Even when I first came to China, I found the built environment here oppressive, but I couldn't articulate why at all. Like, I just had no idea how to even begin to talk about that. And so I think how I got into this was just trying to read about history of urban planning and architecture and stuff, and figure out why I was so unsettled by certain parts of Chinese cities.
Tombstone urbanism. So what is this, and where does it come from?
Tombstone urbanism is a slightly tongue-in-cheek term for the prevailing method of urban development in China since the real estate market opened up in the late 90s, which is that you sell a big plot of land, or the government, because the government owns all the land in China, you sell a big plot of land to a developer, and the developer quickly fills it with 30-story high-rises and nothing else. Right. And so those tall buildings look like, because they're just in perfect rows. And so they just look like tombstones. Those are called super blocks, right? They're typically enormously huge plots of land.
So what do super blocks do to a city?
Basically, it's like monoculture. It just absolutely ruins the richness of a city. And that there's only one use for this plot of land. It's just boring, right? You just walk around and it's like some sickly plants and then apartment buildings, which is bad for the soul. But more practically, it's bad for the environment, because if you need to go anywhere, you have to get into a car and drive. And so it encourages car use. And of course, these super blocks are always surrounded by 8-lane highways, which are meant to facilitate the cars. So
the irony being, of course, if you are in a place that has an ancient history and has really old cities, these cities were not initially built for cars, right? This is This is not Chicago. This is not Los Angeles. These are places that were functioning with millions of people without mechanical transport. But the decision was made that this was the type of modernism that China wanted, not the kind of mixed use development, which by the 1990s was already in favor in the West, but the Chinese developers or the Chinese government decided that what was modern and what they wanted to bring was car driven, as opposed to more hybrid use.
Yeah. And so, that's what I talk about in my article. And I mean, to be fair, the West didn't do a good job with this either. I mean, and there were people at the time criticizing us as we were doing this in the 50s and 60s. The Life and Death of Great American Cities came out in 1960, but it was very well established that this was a terrible mode of urban development by the time China started building these. And to be fair, cities were massively overcrowded. And people lived in homes that were tiny, and it was extremely uncomfortable, and people had been deprived for a really long time. So, and this is also just anecdotally something that happened in the former Soviet Union as well, is once it fell, as people were just absolutely raring to get cars and drive everywhere, even if it meant sitting in traffic forever. It was also efficient, right, is to create more housing as quickly as possible, is to just sell off the land to developers who would build towers as quickly as possible. It was a good short-term solution, but it was not a good long-term solution in terms of the environment, and also in terms of just like the urban fabric that we see today.
So just to put some facts around the superblock phenomenon, you quote a study that looked into comparing the intersections per kilometer of new areas in Beijing, of hutongs, of Pudong, and then Paris and Barcelona. So the new areas in Beijing have 14 intersections per kilometer. Hutongs have 119. Pudong and Shanghai has 17, and Paris, Barcelona, in turn are all over 125. So just to give you a sense of the density of streets and intersections there. One counterpoint to your take on the superblock from Yan, a fan of the show and an architect based here in Beijing. So, is the superblock really entirely bad just because it looks imposing and is overscaled at first sight? Surely we're prone to condemn this type of generic, identityless construction, as we like buildings with so-called character. But culture and character have a weight. They make an imprint on you. When you move into an old house in an old city, you choose to be imprinted. What if one doesn't want that kind of imprint? Actually, the kind of plain, dull, generic space might be the freest way of living. you can truly be who you are, free of the weight and culture of history.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair criticism. And I do talk about this in one of my Superblock articles. I think the second one about the desire for anonymity, especially after, just constant surveillance of the Mao era, is that people were just really excited to move into these completely anonymous plots in identical 30-story apartment buildings. And I'm very sympathetic to that as well. Like sometimes I live in an old work unit housing, it's like 5 stories at most, and there's guards, ba'an, who are there all the time, and sometimes I just don't fucking want to talk to them about where I was going or
what color your hair is,
what my hair is, or what I bought at the market, because they always do demand to see my groceries every time I go in. And so, I mean, I totally feel that. I just don't think, I think that you can have that kind of anonymous or more anonymous living without the super block, right? Like, I think it's possible to build high-rise housing. And by the way, you should build high-rise housing, because there's the need for it, right? Because there is a terrible housing shortage in a lot of areas. I just don't think that you should build them in super blocks.
Make the first story a restaurant. It's really not that much to ask.
So it's the difference between having a perimeter block and having a gated compound, right? Because for a perimeter block, it's all the apartments are street facing, and then you can easily install retail and stuff on the first floor. But if it's just a walled block with towers inside of it, it's much harder to put retail on the first floor, right? Because you'll go in streets in Beijing, and this was happening today as I was cycling, you'll just be cycling down a street and it's just a wall. Yeah, on one side. And so there's like a lot of practical things with how to do this. And yeah, I mean, I don't think the super blocks are unsalvageable, but I also don't think anyone's ever going to change anything about them.
You wrote about one paper in one city that's trying to do some reform efforts. What are the main hurdles to opening up these gated super blocks?
I mean, I think it's just a combination of that NIMBYism, is that people don't want cars going through their super block, right? Because all the efforts at opening up the super blocks have really been for alleviating traffic.
Yeah,
not for pedestrians.
I mean, I will say, as someone who lives at a super block in an inward facing building, not hearing cars is a pretty pleasant thing.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And so, as long as efforts at rectifying the super block are just aimed at giving cars more roads, it's not good. No one likes that, except maybe the technocrats at the top. But the technocrats at the top also don't really give a shit, and I really don't think they are going to reform existing super blocks. So
yeah, well, it's the sort of the NIMBYism as well as if you're the first one, then your property value goes down because you don't have the quiet birds chirping. You have cars honking in your ears. Let's turn now to these building hats. These little pagodas that are stuck on top of some super blocks. I think the Beijing
it's most morbid in Beijing. Yeah.
So what's going on there?
So this is a phenomenon that's not limited to Beijing, but is most prevalent in Beijing, which is just plopping a hat on a building. And by a hat, I mean kind of, if you imagine, your third grade self imagines a Chinese roof, right? Kind of the slightly curved roof with the overhanging eaves. And it's kind of been this phenomenon that has existed since the Republican era, because that's when people started having the idea to not build as they had been building for 2,000 years, to just put a Chinese hat on top of a block and say that's kind of the mixing of Western and Chinese architecture.
So lastly, let's talk a little bit about central heating. So everyone in the South complains that they're actually colder than Northerners. What's going on with this?
Well, China has something called the North-South heating divide, which has its origins in the 1950s after the founding of New China, and basically resource scarcity. And of course, people, you could only, when you were building new housing, which was not actually that much new housing that was being built during that time, but you were building work unit housing and there was only so much resources. And so they kind of just made an executive decision everywhere north of the Huai River in the Qin Mountains. Yes, the Qinhuai line gets central heat, and everywhere.
This is something Zhou Enlai picked out.
Zhou Enlai, supposedly Zhou Enlai decided on this, and everyone's house does not. And it's kind of just the classic, kind of brutal decisions that just get made during that time. But it persists to this day. So developers who build new housing south of that line are not compelled to install central heating. And so people, if you live somewhere like Nanjing or Shanghai, which has maybe climate of, say, Washington, D.C., you don't have heat in your house. You don't have central heating, which means that if you want heat, your only heat source is a window unit or a kongtiao. I don't know. What's the English name for that? I don't know. But it's like a thing you fix to your wall and it blows out. It's not coming from it's not connected. I had to do a lot of HVAC research for this article. It's not there's not a duct connecting to a source of natural gas outside. So it's just electric, and it doesn't work very well because heat rises, So you're just really fucking cold if you live anywhere south of that. And nothing has really ever been done to remedy it. It doesn't look like anybody is going to change the policy. And so now what happens is rich people, and you see ads for this all over, where I live, Chengdu, which is south of the line, in places like Shanghai and Nanjing, rich people can install dinuan, which is floor heating. So you have these little coils of heating.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah, under your floor. And it's expensive, but it can be done. And apparently that works pretty well. I wouldn't know because I didn't have it this winter, so it was extremely miserable. But yeah, it's a real bummer.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this has been a bit of a bummer of an episode. I wonder if we could close, Lauren, on some recommendations for contemporary pop culture for folks looking to get into not looking to maybe relight their flame.
Oh,
post,
man.
Post this bummer of an episode.
Oh man. It's funny, the first thing that came to my mind was this rapper called Bloods Boy, because he's very much on the right side of history, and he's just very movingly honest to me. He's on Twitter, you can look him up, his English is pretty good, but he's also extremely depressed, so he's maybe not the best person to follow. But I appreciate his honesty, and I don't know, just really young Chinese people. I recently became a huge fan of the South Korean, megastar boy group BTS, and through that I connected with some teens in my area, and we do go to fan events together occasionally, and they're just so cute and excited about things, and they use VPN to look at BTS content because
that's amazing. So
much of it is outside of the firewall. I mean, I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you want to overthrow the regime, you need to get the CIA to infiltrate BTS and just stick some messages about overthrowing the CCP in it, and these teen girls will be on it. And they also did the same thing for Chris Wu of EXO, who we mentioned earlier. They also jumped the firewall to buy his album. So people have all kinds of reasons. I think it's mostly that and porn, actually, is why people use VPN.
Yeah.
But you can just hope people will kind of eventually learn something. But no, I mean, I don't know. I just remember that, the Chinese nation state is not the same as Chinese people, which is, I think, a mistake a lot of people, including our friends the Higher Brothers, make, is conflating a people with a authoritarian regime, right? They're different, and no regime, whatever its color, deserves to be accepted from criticism. So I think there needs to be more people to people contact. One of my pet projects that I hope to accomplish within a year is I just want to make a very simple documentary about the lives of my baoans, who are the security guards in my xiaoqu, and just the lives of middle-aged Chinese men, and just because they're very cute. They cook for each other inside of the gatehouse area.
Yeah.
And just what they see, I think there needs to be more reporting on the lives of everyday people. Encouraging pop culture. Yeah, see, a few years ago I would have said the Higher Brothers, although I'm a little worried about their no, I mean, I don't know, where I live in Chengdu, there's just a really cool underground culture of people who are just really into fashion and really into music. If there's this one club called Funky Town that I recommend visiting if you ever go to Chengdu, and it's free. It's tiny, but it's free, and it's just packed with kids with the most crazy fashion. You see trans kids even, which is something you basically never see in China.
Yeah.
And so that's really cool. And I think whenever anyone is genuinely really excited about something, that's always something that makes me happy. And that's kind of what I try to gravitate to in my writing, is people who are who are really passionate about something rather than just surviving.
Yeah,
right?
I will say the working with the PKU musical club and putting on Hamilton was an incredibly encouraging, happy thing.
Yeah, dude.
The Jiao Dai Club in Beijing,
Jiao Dai,
which is also a pretty gay friendly place. And just like amateur hip hop shows are so, people are making no money doing this stuff, but they love it and they record these full albums. Like I saw someone propose to his girlfriend on stage once. There's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of sort of like raw talent and young people, as well as people who've been doing this stuff for 10 years, but who are still kind of out there just like having fun being on stage. Also, I would say, Huaju, modern drama in Beijing. If folks want to get on Damai and just go to some stuff, there's a Gulo theater, which is small, maybe like a black box that seats maybe 200. Half the shows they do are translated from English, and they're just wonderful.
Yeah, it's all about the subcultures. I mean, those are the things that make me not depressed and even happy. So focus on those.
Lauren, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Of course, happy to be here.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from Sup China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
So my in-laws just called to let us know they're on their way over and we're out of food. Great. Luckily, Instacart helps me get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour. Plenty of time to cook an in-law-worthy meal. Now, what to make? Chicken parm. Perfect. Download the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $10 off your first order using the code PREPARED10. Now the only thing to worry about is dinner conversation. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.